Picture this. You walk into a garden center on a Saturday morning, coffee in hand, no real plan. 20 minutes later, you're in the checkout line with 3 trays of something you can't even pronounce yet, and the tag says low maintenance, spreads easily. That phrase, spreads easily, should come with a warning label. Because in gardening, easy is not the same as safe. I'm Mr. Hope. 25 years of doing this the hard way, one shovel at a time, so you don't have to make the same mistakes I did. Every plant on this list is something I've grown myself, some in my very first garden back in the early 90s, some more recently. I made these mistakes with my own 2 hands before I ever thought to warn anyone about them. And after the last couple of videos on this channel, I got a surprise. Thousands of you showed up in the comments with almost the exact same stories, the same vines, the same "why won't this thing die" ground covers. It turns out the mistakes I made in my own backyard are the same mistakes gardeners have been making for decades, coast to coast. So this list is personal, but I'll admit right up front a few of you called out something I'd gotten wrong myself, and I'm folding that correction in too. Let's dive in. Number 10. Orange Ditch Lily Hemerocallis fulva. Not every daylily is a problem. That's the first thing to clear up because a lot of gardeners lump the whole daylily family in together, and that's not fair to the well-behaved hybrids. The issue is specifically the old orange roadside variety, the one growing in ditches and abandoned lots all over the country, which is exactly where it earned its nickname. This plant spreads by thick underground tubers, not seed, which means pulling the tops off does nothing. The root system just sends up a new fan of leaves a few inches away year after year until a single clump becomes a colony that swallows a whole bed. Dig with a spade, not a fork. You need to lift the whole tuber mass in one motion, or fragments left behind will resprout. Early fall, while the soil is still workable, is the best window. Native swap butterfly weed Asclepias tuberosa gives you the same hot orange color from a clumping plant native across nearly all of the continental U.S. zones, 3 to 9, and it's a host plant for monarch caterpillars. For height and a lily-like flower, Turk's cap lily Lilium superbum is native to the eastern half of the country zones 4-8, and stays in a clump. Number 9 Pachysandra terminalis. Sold as the answer to nothing grows under my trees, and it is for about 5 years. Then it stops being a ground cover and starts being the only thing in your yard. Pachysandra spreads by underground stems called stolons, and it's patient. It doesn't explode overnight. It creeps a few inches a season until one day you realize the lawn edge you dug 3 years ago has disappeared under a solid green mat. Cut a hard trench edge every spring with a flat spade. That's the only thing that actually holds the line. Once it's past the edge, you set full removal means lifting the mat in sections and checking for stem fragments left in the soil. Native swap Canadian wild ginger Asarum canadense for deep shade, native to the eastern half of the US and Canada zones 4-8. For a spot with a little more light foam flower, Tiarella cordifolia, also eastern native zones 3-8. If you're west of the Rockies Pacific, wild ginger Asarum caudatum is the regional equivalent zones 6-9. Both stay in a tidy footprint and actually feed native pollinators, which Pachysandra does not. Number 8 Valerian. Valeriana officinalis. Herbalists love this one, and I understand why. Pale pink flower heads a reputation as a calming herb and bees can't stay away from it. What the herbal tea aisle doesn't mention is what happens after the flowers fade. The seed heads go fluffy and airborne, almost like a dandelion, and the wind does the rest. A single mature plant can seed a surprising radius of your property in one season. Underground, the root is thick and fleshy, more like a carrot than a typical fibrous perennial root, and it snaps off easily when you try to pull it, leaving enough behind to grow right back. Deadhead before the seed heads go fluffy. That single step stops most of next year's spread. For the parent plant, loosen the soil deeply on all sides before pulling so the taproot comes out whole. Native swap Joe Pye weed Eutrochium purpureum for a similar pink cloud of flowers at a bigger scale, native to the eastern 2/3 of the U.S. zones 4-9. If you want something more compact, wild bergamot Monarda fistulosa, native across nearly the whole country zones 3, 9, and bees love it just as much as they love valerian. Number 7 Rose Campion lichnis coronaria. Silver felted leaves and hot magenta flowers. It photographs beautifully, and that's exactly the problem. It's a short-lived perennial, which sounds harmless, but short-lived is code for reproduces, like it's running out of time. Every flower head becomes a seed pod, and Rose Campion drops seed generously into every open patch of soil nearby. Snip spent flower stalks the moment the color fades before the pods dry and split. Leave a few if you want some self-seeding for a cottage look, but don't let the whole planting go to seed at once. Native swap. For that same silvery foliage, without the seeding problem, Pussytoes Antenaria planigenifolia native across most of the eastern and central U.S. zones, 3/8 forms a low silver mat. For height and a magenta-adjacent color Ozark blazing star, Liatris pycnostochia, or a native bee balm cultivar, in a hot pink shade, both fill the same spot in the border zones 3/9. Number 6. Liriope the wrong kind. Liriope spicata versus Liriope muscari. This one deserves its own explanation, because there are two Liriopes sold under nearly the same name, and only one of them is a problem. Liriope muscari grows in a tidy clump like an ornamental grass and behaves itself for decades. Liriope spicata runs by underground rhizomes and does not stop at the edge of the bed. It moves into the lawn, under walkways into the neighbor's yard. Garden centers rarely label which one you're buying, and the two look almost identical on the shelf. If you already have it and it's crossed a border you didn't intend, dig a trench along the edge and sever the rhizomes, then monitor for new shoots each spring for at least 2 years. Native swap Pennsylvania sedge Carex pennsylvanica gives you the same fine-textured grass-like shade ground cover native to the eastern half of the U.S. zones 3/8, and it stays exactly where you plant it. In the Pacific Northwest western fescue, Festuca occidentalis fills the same role zones 5/9. Number 5. English Ivy Hedera helix. The classic. The one that made ivy-covered sound romantic before anyone thought about what happens after 20 years. As a ground cover, it's manageable for a while. The real trouble starts when it finds something vertical, a tree, a fence, the side of your house, and starts climbing. Once it's on a mature tree, ivy doesn't just look messy. It blocks light to the tree's own leaves, adds enormous weight during wet winters, and can eventually weaken or kill the host tree outright. Cut every climbing stem at the base first at chest height and again near the soil, then let the vine above die and dry out before pulling it down. Trying to strip a live vine off bark can damage the tree more than the ivy itself. For ground cover mats, lift and roll them back like carpet checking for rooted nodes as you go. Native swap Virginia creeper Parthenocissus quinquifolia itself, native across nearly the entire continental U.S. zones 3/9. More on why this one's actually fine in a minute. If you want fragrance and flowers instead of foliage, coral, honeysuckle Lonicera sempervirens native to the eastern and central U.S. zones 4/9, and hummingbirds prefer it over most non-native honeysuckle. Number 4. Field bindweed mistaken for morning glory convolvulus arvensis. This is one I get asked about more than almost anything else, so let's settle it. True morning glory is an annual. It grows from seed each year, puts on a big show, and mostly dies back with frost. What most gardeners are actually fighting for years, myself included, is field bindweed, a perennial relative with smaller white or pale pink trumpet flowers and a root system that goes down feet, not inches. Bindweed twines around anything upright, perennials, shrubs, even young trees, and it regenerates from tiny root fragments, which means tilling or careless pulling can multiply the problem instead of solving it. Don't till the area. Cut the top growth repeatedly through the season to exhaust the root's energy reserves, rather than trying to dig it all out at once for an established patch. This is a multi-season project. Native swap. If you want a perennial vine with that same twining habit but none of the invasiveness, Virgin's bower. Clematis virginiana is native to the eastern 2/3 of the U.S. zones 3/8, with fragrant white flowers in late summer. If you specifically want the trumpet-shaped flower plant True Morning Glory Ipomea purpurea as an annual instead, it's not native, but it dies back on its own each year and won't establish a permanent root system. Number 3. Trumpet vine Campsis radicans. Hummingbirds love it, which is exactly how it gets sold as a wildlife plant with almost no downside mentioned. The downside is underground. Trumpet vine spreads by aggressive root suckers that can travel well beyond the base of the plant and pop up through cracks in pavement in the middle of flower beds along foundations. For young plants, dig them out completely while the root system is still small. For an established vine, cut it back hard and treat the freshly cut stump with a targeted brush killer. Cutting alone just prompts more root suckers. Native swap coral honeysuckle Lonicera sempervirens, native to the eastern and central U.S. zones 4-9, gives hummingbirds the same nectar source without the runaway root system. In the southwest, native trumpet honeysuckle relatives or scarlet trumpet vine cultivars bred as non-invasive are a regional option worth asking your local extension office about. Before we get to the last two, I want to own something. When I first sat down to plan this video, English ivy and Virginia creeper were both on my regret it pile. I'd fought both of them over the years and honestly hadn't stopped to separate the two. A lot of you called that out in the comments with real detail about how Virginia creeper actually behaves. It climbs with little adhesive pads instead of digging into bark. It feeds native birds, and it doesn't strangle the tree. It's growing on the way ivy does. I went back out to my own garden, took a closer look at the creeper still growing on my back fence, and you were right. It's not the same plant, and it doesn't belong on this list. I've fixed that above. That's the deal on this channel. I'll show you what I've learned the hard way over 25 years, and when I get something wrong, I'll go check it against my own garden and correct it, same as always. Number 2. Gooseneck Loosestrife Lysomachia clothroides. Curved white flower spikes that genuinely do look like a flock of tiny geese, and that's the entire reason people plant it. Underneath, it's running rhizomes in every direction, and by year 3 or 4, a single clump has turned into a solid patch that crowds out everything nearby, including plants you actually wanted to keep. Start digging the outer edge of the clump now, while you can still see where it ends. Every season you wait, that perimeter gets bigger and the job gets harder. Native swap Culver's root Veronicastrum virginicum, native to the eastern half of the U.S. and parts of the Midwest zones, 3-8 gives you the same tall white flower spikes in a well-mannered clump. Number 1. Creeping Bellflower and Bishop's Weed. I'm putting 2 plants at number 1 because honestly they were tied. Between the two of them, these are the perennials I hear about more than anything else on this channel, more than any shrub, any vine, any ground cover. Creeping Bellflower Campanula rapunculoides has a taproot that goes down more than a foot plus a spreading rhizome system underneath that, so pulling the top rarely gets you anywhere. It's often passed along between neighbors as a pretty purple bellflower with no warning about what's coming. Bishop's Weed Agopodium podagraria, sometimes sold as a variegated ground cover, spreads through a dense mat of shallow, brittle roots. Every fragment left behind grows into a new plant, which makes it one of the few perennials where digging can genuinely make things worse if you're not thorough. For bellflower, dig deep a foot or more and sift the soil to catch root fragments. For Bishop's Weed, never rototill the area. Hand dig in sections and remove roots completely rather than chopping through them. Native swap. For the bellflower's purple color harebell Campanula, rotundifolia is native across most of North America, including the northern and mountain states zones 2-7, and stays in a controlled clump. For Bishop's Weed's ground cover roll, barren strawberry Geum fragarioides, also sold as Waldstenia fragarioides, native to the eastern U.S. zones 4-8, or golden groundsel Pachera aurea, also eastern native zones 3-8. For a shade ground cover that actually flowers in spring. 10 plants. Every single one of them looked completely reasonable in a pot at the GardenCenter. And every one of them has cost somebody, maybe you, years of digging to undo. If you saw your own plant on this list, you're not alone and you're not a bad gardener. You just got sold the pretty half of the story. Drop your own regret in the comments and tell me your state or zone. It helps me know what to dig into for next time, and half of you clearly already know more than I gave you credit for. Hit subscribe because there's a lot more of my own dirt to dig through yet.